All right, well, hello everybody. Thank you for coming. As I've been introduced before, my name is Matthew Swindell. I'm the Associate Director at the Manchester by the Sea Museum. And I am, I would say, something of a specialist in this area's history. And as Tom introduced my thesis, I'm also something of an enthusiast in transportation history in this region. So this lecture topic is founded on my thesis, Street Railway, Embrace and Resistance on the Massachusetts North Shore. And my thesis was that street railways developed on the Massachusetts North Shore divergently between industrial centers that were to include a range of socio and economic classes, demographics, from more modest people up. And they were allowing street railways to come to the communities to foster the affordable transportation that they offered. On the other hand, there were communities that developed on the North Shore that developed into summer resort communities that fostered a peaceful atmosphere, a tranquil atmosphere, harkening back to an earlier time, and refused to have the change of street railways that were going to bring change and disruption to the communities that were contrary to creating summer resorts. So, I would first, before going into the topic, I would like to extend a thank you to the Manchester Cricket and also the Friends of the Public Library for providing the digitized Manchester Cricket. And I saw Erica Brown is here today, and I'd like to give a round of applause. Because the Manchester Cricket is a vital resource in doing the thesis, and I'm not sure if I would have been able to do it, provide resources that I used, if not for the digitized cricket. I'd also like to extend a thank you to the one and only, the founder of the cricket, Isaac M. Marshall, because it's his reporting that is the backbone of the cricket, and even he dropped, I think, the editorial we sometimes, and even use the first person when he's interviewing people. And this was his baby, and it was his passion, and without his dedication to reporting here in Manchester, I'm not sure this would be possible as well. Now, I will say the cricket was opposed to a trolley in Manchester. As much as he described the progression of details in detail, you could tell he was not in favor of it. Nevertheless, he did give coverage to those who were proponents for the trolley. Now, to get into the situation of the trolley in Massachusetts. Now, this is the tri-state trolley map from 1910. And at that point, the Boston Northern was a big trolley company, and connection with the Old Colony Railroad down in the South Shore, there was a whole network of trolley lines across eastern Massachusetts. And it was a very significant force, because you have to remember this was before the automobile was commonplace. One could have a private carriage, horses and buggy, and also take railroad, the steam railroad, but forgetting within the city streets, affordably, the street railway was a vital resource, and it was a big business in Massachusetts before the automobile. Now, almost every town on the North Shore has a trolley. If you can see up there, there's Lynn, there's Salem, there's Marblehead, Beverly, even up to Essex and Gloucester. But you might notice there's a gap there. Because Manchester did not have the trolley. It is well accommodated by the steam railroad. You can see the West Manchester, the Manchester and Magnolia stations, but no street railroad. Now, I first found out about Manchester's trolley situation reading Joseph Garland's History of the North Shore, his social history of summers among the noteworthy, fashionable, rich, eccentric, and ordinary. And it's a wealth of information. He did use the Manchester Historical Society as a source. He worked with Slim Proctor in creating that book. I believe it's out of print, but it's not too hard to get a copy of the revised, combined edition. I recommend it. Now, he mentioned that Manchester banned the trolleys, and maybe it seems self-explanatory from his other details of social life on the North Shore, but I wanted to find out why exactly and how Manchester didn't get the trolley. And it was part of my thesis research, so I expanded across the North Shore from early days to eventually the decline of the street railroad. But Manchester formed a vital part of my research. And so today, bringing that Manchester story, focusing on it, and providing more details that I didn't put in the thesis for lack of cluttering it, to share to you today, and I will say there's some characters, and I wish I had time to go into all of their stories, because they said Isaac and Marshall tried some good reporting in their interviews of a lot of different people in town. But I pulled a few, and you'll hear some of them. Now, before I get to Manchester, I'll give you some background. Now, it goes back to the horse car era, because before trolleys, there were street railroads run by horses. And that is a picture of horse cars in Salem. The Nomtec Street Railway was the provider. Now, horse cars, they go back to the 1830s in New York. When the first one opened, this was something, a tremendous moment, at least according to our source, that the mayor of New York, he commemorated the first day of service, saying that the events when horse cars first came on the scene, the first day of service would go down in the history of our country as the greatest achievement of man. Now that might have been a little bit of an overstatement, but nevertheless they were to be an important force for public transportation. And there was a lull in how street railroads were adopted, but by the 1850s there was a sensation of street railways, and Boston ended up having a variety of different companies, and then it went up to the North Shore, and by the 1860s you had street railways in Lynn, and then they were coming to Salem. Gloucester was a little late. They didn't get it until the 1880s. But there was something about the street railroad, about the horse railroad, that had an edge over the omnibus, which had to go over the muddy streets of the time. And the street railroad running on rails was already having the novelty of being on rails, as the steam railroad was very popular. It could be cheaper because it could hold a larger capacity, because the cars could be lighter running on the rails, and with the less friction they could run. I wouldn't say they were running that fast, but faster than the omnibus. They had to contend with everything else going on the road. So, street railroads, they became quite popular as a form of cheap transportation, and it was a democratizing force, if you will, though they were opposed by summer resorts, growing summer resorts here on the North Shore. So Salem had them, Lynn had them, Gloucester had them, but there was a sort of opposition that formed in some summer communities. And particularly, you go to Swampscott early on in the horse car era, there was opposition in the mid-1880s that was overcome, and that was celebrated in the history of Swampscott by Mr. Thompson. He reported on this, as Joseph Garland reported, a popular ditty that was going around, and I'll read that to you. Hail today, cheap transportation comes in triumph to our station, bearing in its train the story, anti-monopoly, the people's glory. Roll it along to all the town, the people's right, cheap transportation. See the people come to meet us, all at the station many greet us, all take seats with exultation, glory in cheap transportation. Now, horse railroads, as evidenced by this ditty, they were becoming a class division issue. And proponents saw them as an amenity of modern life, something to sort of a civilizing force a new amenity to provide transportation for the common man and bring one neighbor closest to his other neighbor, and as a real net benefit. Of course, the companies saw as a benefit for their profits as well, as opponents wouldn't hesitate to remark, as these were private companies, mind you. Public transportation at that time was a private industry. And opponents feared that there was going to be an invasion of their communities by a mass of people and a loss of privacy, their summer resorts that they paid dearly to have. And in Beverly Farms, there was so much opposition to a street railway going to the Cove that it was an impetus for a division movement in the 1880s. Of course, there were other reasons as well, tax load being high, etc., but the horse railroad was an impetus, sort of an inciting incident, that they were going to extend it to the border of the farms there at Chapman Corner, about where the dividing line was put. And notice that the horse railroad is marked on this map as an amenity. And I will say, unfortunately for the Beverly farmers, that they wanted their own town, that they almost got their wish, but in 1887, their petition was vetoed by the governor after going through the House and the Senate. So there never was an independent Beverly Farms, though they did have a certain victory because the street railroad never went into the farms. Now, this time, now getting to Manchester, as the crisis was ongoing in 1887, it was reported by the Cape Ann Advertiser that the Manchester people want horse cars pretty bad, and the company wants to accommodate them. At this time, it was the Nomke company. And then there's a dig on the Beverly Farms summer residents, and they won't want the telephones. And one could see sort of how horse railroads are politicized in this case. And one might also wonder, who are the Manchester people that want the street railways bad at this point in 1887? Now, Manchester in the mid-19th century was still a mill town of sorts. It was a furniture-making center. And it's shown here with some mills visible from Town Hill. Now, there already was a summer colony present. I mean, by 1887, the Masconomo House had, I think, a year to go before it would be celebrating the 10th anniversary of that Grand Hotel in Manchester. Certainly, there was already a summer colony present, and the summer resort industry was growing. But you still had some furniture making, but it was certainly on decline. Unfortunately, the Civil War hurt the once prosperous furniture industry, and the southern market, which was very vital to the manufacturers, was blockaded, disrupted. And then after the war, there was a return to business, but you had these centers out west where the timber was more plentiful, places like Grand Rapids, Michigan, that were better situated for making furniture, and larger centers that could take over the trade more efficiently than the small shops of Manchester. So there was a real decline by the late 19th century in furniture making. And what became the sort of moneymaker, if you will, of Manchester was beautiful scenery. Its cool ocean breezes that brought people here, attracted people from the city who had the means to buy land along the shore, have a house, or perhaps rent a house from somebody else, or stay at the Masconomo House. Manchester became a summer resort, predominantly by the late 19th century. And the railroad was vital to this, the railroad coming by the 1840s, and by the end of the century there was 3 railroad stations, as I mentioned, West Manchester, Manchester, Magnolia. And if one had the means, there was special trains. There was what the detractors called the dude train, but was called the Flying Fisherman, $100 a year, express train up to the shore here. And those with the means could also use private rail carriages. So the train, it was efficient, but not necessarily affordable for casual travel. especially for someone of modest means, say a factory worker who has only a few cents and wants to do some leisure, go somewhere. It wasn't necessarily accessible for that purpose. So with not everybody able to afford a train, not everybody could come using the train. Of course, the summer residents mostly were of the wealthier kind, and that was no impediment to Manchester becoming a summer resort for the wealthy, particularly the Boston elite, though people coming from also outside of this area. Now, at this time, there were electric streetcars coming into use, the trolley, by the late 1880s. And they were more efficient than the old horse car. There were no more horses, for one. And of course, there were now the need for new technology and for wires, but by the late 1880s, electric streetcars run by overhead wires established themselves as the leading form of locomotion for street railways. They were a sensation. Joseph Garland remarks that they changed almost overnight, and they replaced horse railways. The Naumkeag Street Railway electrified, and Gloucester electrified. Of course, this was already after Boston, and it was sort of miraculous, if you will. It was reported in Gloucester, and I quote here, "At last we can go from Squam to Rockneck by electricity. No more horse cars, no more tow horses. They are both superseded by the all-powerful spark." Now, humorist Dr. Holmes, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who one might recall, when people started calling Manchester by the sea, he started saying he was from Beverly Farms by the depot. He coined the broomstick train, being the humorist he was. He equated trolley poles with witches' broomstick. It was return of the witches of old, and they come to wreak havoc by latching onto the trolley poles. And he himself was in awe of this electric conveyance. There's no evidence he opposed street railways, because he was welcome to making fun of his neighbors in Beverly Farms who were afraid of the trolley. And I'll read a little bit of the broomstick train. The Swampscott fishermen still relate how a strange sea monster stole their bait, how their nets were tangled in loops and knots, and they found dead crabs in their lobster pots. Poor Danvers grieved for her blasted crops, and Wilmington mourned over mildewed hops. A blight played havoc with Beverly beans. It was all the work of those hateful queens. A dreadful panic began at Pride's, where the witches stopped in their midnight rides. And there rose strange rumors and vague alarms amid the peaceful dwellers at Beverly Farms. So at this point, trolleys were opposed at Beverly Farms, and so the witches being stopped there represents how those trolleys weren't allowed past the cove, and were not allowed into Manchester either. Now, the broomstick train had a name. It caught on popularly as a name for trolleys, as you can see by this brochure. It trips on broomstick trains, and trolleys became, as the improvement of the horse railroad, a popular means of leisure, not only for going to different parks like Salem Willows, which was founded by the Naumkeag Street Railway Company, or Revere Beach, or to Long Beach in Rockport, but as a trip of their own, trolley trips, and one could take in the scenery of the area, perhaps take in picnic parties. And so this was something, I suppose you could say, democratic, because the trolleys were cheap. 5 cents fare became standard. And one could expect, if one from say, a factory city, to take in the country by trolley. Now, this does bring us back to Manchester by the Sea. In the 1890s, particularly in 1892, it seems that those broomstick witches were on an offensive on the North Shore, because by late that year, there were rumors spreading of a new project meant to connect Beverly and Gloucester. And in December, there was a petition to have a Gloucester, Manchester, and Beverly Street Railway Company. And And these incorporated, they were reported as men of wealth, and the cricket predicted that money will not be wanting to build and equip the road if the charter is granted. And the route was not yet clear, but intended to bring streetcars to Manchester and Beverly Farms and hope not to injure the shore drives, so not to oppose the summer residents, not to try to aggravate them, but to try to accommodate them. Though the cricket was skeptical that that was possible. And as you can see here, it calls it a great scheme. So I don't think Mr. Marshall was very favorable to that. And it's theorized that costly improvements on the thoroughfares of Manchester and Gloucester were a conspiracy to accommodate streetcars, as a street railway would need a road to be more maintained than just one without. Now, the cricket did reference that the Beverly Times reported that summer residents were consulted and not oppose it, but nevertheless, the cricket's resistance suggested otherwise. And ultimately, in 1893, there was so much contention, and the cricket reported that town, I will say, we all understand what this town relies upon is dependent on for weal or woe. There was not a man who would knowingly vote for a thing that would to deprecate her value or destroy her beauty, opposing the street railway as something that would change Manchester against the wishes of the summer residents, and it would possibly ruin the town as that industry was so important. So, because of all this opposition, ultimately, the petitioners redirected. They ended up taking the detour, because they didn't go to Manchester, they became the Gloucester, Essex, and Beverly Street Railway. And according to the Essex section of the cricket, the stockholders evidently saw a quicker return of their expenditures if they could have passed through the farms to Gloucester, but the remonstrance was so strong, the farms route was abandoned. Now, the company, they incorporated a special provision, however, so that there wouldn't be any changes from further companies. There was a provision that dictated nor shall any railway in any event, and I'll skip over the Beverly part, be constructed or operated in the town of Manchester on or south of what is known as the Old Wenham Road leading from Pleasant Street, nor in said Manchester beyond a radius of 1 mile from the extreme northwest corner thereof. So as Joseph Garland notes in his history, Manchester banned the trolley. So, this point is, Essex had a trolley. It opened by 1895 and it connected Beverly and Gloucester. People would have to go the long way around, Manchester being left out, which was good or bad depending on one's point of view. Nevertheless, despite the fact that it was banned in 1893, and one might think that was the last word on the subject, it certainly was not, because rumors began of another attempt at bringing the trolley to Manchester. Now, the Essex route really was something of a detour, and from Essex, one could have a theoretical avenue for expansion. There was rumors in 1897 that the president of the Gloucester, Essex, and Beverly was eyeing a branch road to get into Manchester down from Essex, and theorized that probably the only way, that the cricket theorized probably the only way that one could do so was take the old Essex Road, which was an unused road that probably wouldn't be an impediment. Now, ultimately, this just was a rumor. Of course, more was yet to come, however. Though it does seem to have inspired debate in the town, because the Manchester's Young Men's League, they formed a debate club, and they debated, and it was December 1897, will electric cars be a benefit to Manchester? And as you can already see here, they decided it would not be a benefit to Manchester. Though they made good points both ways. Interesting enough, the man who did the closing argument, Alex Lodge, I believe he's the founder of the North Shore Breeze later on. So, I'm not sure that Breeze was a supporter of the trolley, but I haven't researched that fact. Now, Of course, there was even more yet to come. I haven't gone to the climax yet. Within a few years of the young these debates, a syndicate of wealthy Boston gentlemen launched a new initiative. And here's where things get interesting. This North Shore Street Railway Company, it was reported planned to have a resort at Wingershire Beach, also known as Coffin's Beach, and connect West Gloucester to that resort, and then go down through Magnolia, and then not go around Magnolia Point, but go down Magnolia Ave, and eventually go towards Manchester, going on Raymond Street, connecting into Summer Street. And then once it went, the plan was that once it got into the heart of Manchester, it wasn't going to go right through the village. It was going to take a somewhat circumventional path, because at that point, I think they knew that if they tried to go right through the village, there would be so much opposition that they couldn't do it. And they even had a contingency plan if this wasn't going to work. But their plan was to go on to Lincoln Street, and then go to Vine, and then go to School, and then Friends Court, and then a new road to be laid out through the land of some gentleman all the way to Pine Street, so sort of behind Sawmill Brook, and then connect to Pine Street, go up Pine Street, and then go on the road to Wenham, which one also is called, I believe, Crooked Lane, and go through the wood roads, past Beverly Farms. And I will say the contingency plan, if this didn't work, was they would take Pleasant Street, of course not as close to the center, but perhaps to be less opposed. Eventually, this was to go connect to Montserrat Station in Beverly. So this was going to connect Montserrat train station to West Gloucester Station, through the North Shore, and through Manchester. And the announcement of this plan in the cricket provoked a great sensation, I will say. The people of Manchester were thoroughly alarmed, or as I'm sure Mr. Marshall had fun with his pun, electrified by the trolley question. And though it had been rumored for some time, and it was thought that it would be some time before this matter would be upon Manchester again, it was upon them then and now, and they had to deal with it. And I would say, Mr. Marshall, he did interview, as I said before, residents of the town, and they really are fascinating. And I really encourage you to go onto the digitized cricket and find this article. It is that article. And you can come talk to me later after the talk if you want any more sources. But to look at what people were saying about the trolleys, because these interviews are fascinating. Now, you had those for and against. And Mr. Walker, well, he was a man against the trolley, and he was a permanent resident since he was due to the request from his father-in-law, Silas Cobb. He was a man of Chicago, a businessman there, and he had come to Manchester to manage Highwood, the great estate in West Manchester. And he was one of Manchester's largest landowners. So he gave some very, very interesting remarks to Mr. Marshall in his interview in opposition to the trolley. He said, "I shall be much disappointed if the people vote the company this franchise. It will be a great calamity to the town, and they would always regret it. Manchester is a place of great natural beauty, its charm being its simple country landscape and privacy. If electrics come in, it is goodbye to all of this. It is not called for. The depreciation of property would be enormous, and it would prevent others from coming here. In summer, it would be a great place for picnic parties. For the life of me, I cannot see how anyone can advocate such a scheme. Take it in my own case. I should consider my property would depreciate 33.33%. It would give everything a black eye. The Boston and Maine are giving us a good train service and adding to it every year. It will not be long before Coffin's Beach is opened as a resort, and the people can go there if they want a little outing. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, we have Mr. Julius F. Robardi. Now, Mr. Robardi, he was a Frenchman by birth, but I'd say an American by nature. He was a Civil War veteran who lost his leg above the knee at the Battle of Antietam. Antietam, I know I said that wrong. A lively and enterprising spirit with great drive. He was a merchant, a politician, an editor, a postmaster, a telegraph operator, an insurance man, and a real estate dealer. And there is his block. It still stands today. And that is Mr. Robardi out front. There's Mr. Robardi. He's a little older than he was at this time. That's about 1920. But that gives you a good sense for the man. And he put things pretty plainly to Mr. Marshall, also making note how there was a greater threat to Manchester to contend with in the rise of the automobile. Now, he said, Mr. Robardi said, I am in favor of electrics. I own property in the village, and I own property on the shore, and I don't believe it will injure either one penny. On the contrary, I think it will be a benefit to me. Much is said of its bringing gravel here. I don't think it will bring a Coxey's army to Manchester. Why should it? And it will not drive any people away. If one does go, there will be 10 coming to take his place. Automobiles can go through town at a tremendous rate, frightening horses, and running things down, and having a terrible smell. Certainly, electrics will be no worse than them. So that gives us an example of for and against arguments for the trolley. Now, these events, they were going to be decided at a fateful town meeting here in Manchester, advertised in advance on Monday, January 5th, 1903. And at this monumental meeting, the discussion was going to be whether that ban, the 1893 provision, would be lifted to allow a street railway to come through Manchester. Now, this was a tremendous event. The paper introduced the subject according to epic proportions, emphasizing that great importance of what would be decided at that event. And the Cricket reported after the fact that Monday evening saw the culmination of one of the most trying periods in the town's history. Never has public sentiment been so stirred and wrought up over any proposed scheme as that which electric cars has produced. It has been on everyone's tongue and practically monopolized the people's attention. But like other matters of great public importance with which the town has had to contend, the issue has been met squarely and settled, it would seem, for all time. Now, the monumental meeting, it was so well attended by ladies and gentlemen that the Cricket reported to be one of the largest town meetings ever held, and that the hall was packed to suffocation and overflowing out on the stairways, and even the platform was invaded. And contributing to this meeting were the summer residents. Though this meeting was held in winter, in January, the summer residents appeared in full force. About 100 of them came on a special train from Boston. And this included some of these men that you see up here, and of course many more, including Thomas Jefferson Coolidge, a Boston businessman, town benefactor. You can thank him for the library. Resident of Marble Palace, at what's today, no longer exists today, but at today's Coolidge Reservation. Richard Henry Dana III, lawyer who summered off of Summer Street, son of Richard Henry Dana the Jr., one of Manchester's first summer residents, his father. Then there was T. Denny Boardman, also the son of an early summer resident, B.G. Boardman. And Mr. Boardman, he was a real estate magnate. And then there was also in attendance, notably, especially for those who have seen our Summers by the Sea exhibit and learned about the Masconomo House Hotel, John B. Schoeffel was present. He was manager of the Tremont Theater, but he, here in Manchester, was proprietor of the Masconomo House and wife to Agnes Booth Schoeffel, who ran the hotel with them. And that was after the death. He was the next husband of Mrs. Booth, after Mr. Booth, Junius Booth, who one might learn was the brother of John Wilkes Booth, and he came up here, founded the Masconomo House. He had died in the 1880s, and she had remarried to Mr. Schoeffel. So I'm not sure if she was there that night. He might have been representing, but it shows that in that faction from the Grand Hotel there was opposition to the Trolley. So the presence of these men here and the many more created, as one would expect, a resistant atmosphere to the Trolley prospect. Now I will say also that the town fathers, these town leaders who you see here, A.S. Jewett, who was the town clerk at the time, F.K. Hooper, moderator, and Samuel Knight here, they were in town government and opposed to the Trolley. So not only did you have the summer residents showing up in full force, but even within town politics, there were these men who were also quite opposed to the Trolleys. So who did you have as proponent with all this opposition? Well, I'd say the chief proponent was the maverick town orator, William C. Rust. He was an old-time resident of Manchester. He was a lively spirit. He was once a minor 49er who had followed the gold rush in California, though he came back. And he was a prominent furniture manufacturer. He was the Rust of Rust and Marshall, once in business with Isaac M. Marshall's father, Nehemiah. And this was pretty characteristic for him, because he really was quite a spirited person and looking out for new advances to benefit Manchester, and he wasn't afraid to go it alone. After he eventually did die in 1913, Mr. Marshall's Cricket reported that Mr. Marshall, he was one who ever maintained a live interest in Manchester's welfare, and who was fearless in his advocacy of any reform or new movement which he believed to be for her best interest, though he might stand alone in that opinion. Now, he had a lot of opposition at that meeting. There was Judge Edgar S. Taft also here at the meeting as a proponent, but generally in the reporting on the issue, the Cricket reports a lot of opposition, and there's that small selection of proponents. So I was a Mr. Rust. He gave some lively words after wishing people a happy new year, because it was the beginning of 1903. He said to the crowd, by reading our local paper and other papers of late, one would think a great calamity threatened the town. And one might think that if electrics came here, our famous singing beach would refuse to sing. The sun would rise on deserted summer homes. The rain would fall on properties depreciated in value, and the snow would fall on the hills and forests bare of habitation as they were years ago. They have figured out that property would depreciate $4 million all at once. And finally, Manchester, instead of a popular summer resort, would simply be a hole to become filled with water, but whether fresh or salt, I cannot tell. That evinces laughter from the crowd too, so it's good you're laughing. Now he went on to urge give electric railroads, give trolleys a chance. He urged people to give them a chance by lifting this ban, and he really wanted to emphasize that, At that meeting, they weren't voting on the franchise, though people thought if they lifted the ban, probably the franchise was going to come. But give the trolleys a chance. Don't restrain Manchester from this potential progress. That was Mr. Russ's point. And of course, he was joined by Judge Taft of Gloucester, but really it was an uphill battle. Now, I'm going to put the question out here. Does anyone recognize this man? If you went to that Sargent exhibit over at the MFA, you might have seen his portraits. Does anyone recognize this man? Prominent summer resident. Hey, did you say Higginson? Yes, you're right. This is Major Henry Lee Higginson. Now, Mr. Higginson, he was a prominent Boston businessman. He was a Civil War officer in the Civil War. He was founder of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, a champion of license plates for automobiles that kept rushing by the state. He was the son-in-law of Louis Agassiz, and he was a summer resident of Manchester who spoke against the trolley. Among other things, he spoke out, and he did give some moving words, I'd say, because there had been threats that people would leave Manchester if the trolley came, some residents, and the calamity that Mr. Russ spoke about. But Mr. Higginson, he said, if the town wants an electric road, I hope you will have it, but I should be very much disappointed. I should not go away. I shall live here until I die. I love Manchester and belong here. Now, after many letters of opposition, and of course there was the argument in favor by Judge Taft, the closing argument, as put by the Cricket, was made by Patrick H. Boyle, who owned a livery stable in town. He did a good business with the summer residents, I will say. His strong argument, as called by the Cricket, it closed as such with these words: "We are simply a summer resort, and the only way to keep it so is to make it pleasant for the summer guests." So, after arguments for and against, ultimately, what do you think was the response of this movement? You think it was for? Do you think it was against? Well, it met a Waterloo, according to the Cricket. With 228 votes against, and any one for the 1893 provisions repeal. So the conclusion at the end of this meeting was that this was settled for all time, and that the trolley would not bother Manchester again for some time, at least some time to come. Though that didn't actually happen that way, because the issue reared its head in the following year again. The petitioners tried again to have a trolley on the North Shore to lift that ban, because that was the first step. You couldn't have a trolley unless you lifted that ban. So the fight for electric was on again, and the petition was circulating in 1904. Now, the paper, Manchester Cricket, it reported negatively on its prospects. The Cricket reported, in fact, if it was possible, the feeling of opposition is even more pronounced now than it was at that time when you had that monumental meeting the year before. And the Cricket reported the people would dare not kill the goose that laid the golden egg of the summer resort industry. And this renewed petition, it did go to the House, but it was stopped at the Senate committee. Franklin K. Hooper, who you might remember, the town leader, he was the moderator, actually, at that monumental town meeting. He was representative of Manchester to the General Court and the House of Representatives. And it was reported, apparently, in the Boston papers that he was in favor of trolleys, but of course he was ready to set the record straight that he was against. And he said, with the business depression by 1904, people have come to look at it differently, the trolley prospect, and have come to realize that Manchester's future prosperity lies wholly in developing its resources as a summer resort. And the Senate committee was convinced, and the issue returned to its grave. The prospect of a Manchester trolley averted. So in the end, Manchester never had a trolley. And perhaps in the end, maybe it was for the best, because the trolley didn't last forever in terms of its significance. Unfortunately, the 1910s, this I'd say, by 1910, that was probably about the peak, because in the 1910s, it was quite a difficult period for street railways. They suffered from rising costs. The technology kept getting replaced by newer technology, and that was a lot of new equipment to have to buy. And then you had labor costs. Street railwaymen, they fought for their labor rights. And unfortunately, people got used to that 5-cent fare, but the companies found it necessary where they really had to raise the fare, say to 10 cents. Of course, that was something seen as a little bit drastic at that time. And you had willing to take advantage of that controversy, jitney buses. And jitney, that was slang for a nickel. These nickel buses, they were taking the cream of the crop of the trolley passengers. And particularly, they did the profit in the summer months. So with the automobile rising, and of course that was a very important part too, trolleys were in deep trouble by the end of the 1910s, and with the World War II and all that disruption. The Bay State Street Railway Company went bankrupt, and its assets were assumed by the Eastern Massachusetts Street Railway. Now, they were given authority. You already had all these jitney buses that were, at times, they were regulated, but often they were not. And there were even ultimatums that town had to regulate. They had to do something about these jitney buses, or they wouldn't even service some towns. And the Eastern Massachusetts Street Railway ultimately got authority to busify themselves, to replace their trolleys with automobile motor buses in 1918. And as the 1920s went on, some of the first to go were the suburban routes. I'll say that these street railways, they kept wanting to expand and expand, and they were speculators hoping for real estate returns from street railways, but unfortunately it ended up being something of a bubble, and with the automobile and all these problems popping. And in suburban service, where it was just not ending up being sustainable to have these trolley routes, these were the first places to go. And Gloucester, Rockport, and Essex, by the dawn of the 1920s, lost their trolley service. So really, Essex only had a trolley for about a quarter of a century, from 1895 to 1920. And by 22, they were ripping up the lines. And eventually, it took a while totally to disappear. Eventually, the Eastern Massachusetts Street Railway really became just the street railway name because they were running so many buses. But it was in 1937, eventually, the last trolley ran on the North Shore. And then that was the end of street railways in this region. So, were they vindicated? Was the resistance to street railways vindicated? Well, there may not have been the street railways to continue with, but as I have continued to mention, there was the automobile, and this was Charles Dodge's car, by the way. So you know the Dodge Furniture Factory, that was Uncle Charlie's car. Automobile use continued to rise, and ultimately, people, if they had an automobile, and as automobiles became more accessible to people versus being more of a luxury object and a sporting object, but as a common means of transportation, people could come to Manchester, go have a picnic party, as Mr. Walker feared, by using an automobile. And ultimately, today, by the mid-century, and as we have today, we have Route 128 going through town, and Manchester ended up coming closer to the metropolis in terms of automobile accessibility. So perhaps as Mr. Robardi was foretelling, maybe they need to watch out more for that automobile. However, in the end, we can conclude that Manchester defeated the trolley in that Manchester versus trolley fight, but ultimately, the automobile wasn't going anywhere. Yes, sir.
Okay, it sounds like it's very similar to that history going back to the 1800s and early 1900s. Very similar to the activity that went on when I first moved to town, having to do with the approval or not of the Cape Ann Transportation Association coming into Manchester. And there's something that we passed some kind of a regulation to not allow that, or we were excluded for some reason. Is the history of the trolley at all tied into this business of why there's no CATA in Manchester?
Well, I wouldn't say directly, though some of the factors involved might be a continuation. I'd say the bus, ultimately the automobile bus, is the descendant of the form of the function of the trolley, providing cheap transportation. So the that bus, I would say, it provides a similar sort of appeal that the trolley would have appealed, and of course also the negatives that the trolley also provided. I don't have the details on that, but I would say that there are parallels. I would say. Yes.
This isn't a question. It's a statement. I used to live at the end of Magnolia Avenue when I first came to Manchester, at the site of the old Magnolia railroad station. The map you have from 1910, that is an authoritative map of where the stations are, says that there's a Magnolia train station. Well, there was, but it was in Manchester, and it shows that and that map shows that it's in Gloucester. So there were 3 railroad stations in Manchester, West, Central, and Magnolia. That was in Manchester.
Oh, you're right. You're right. I think that they made a mistake in placing a little too far into Gloucester. And another one, in 1898, they were even marking. It's interesting what the street railway companies are putting on their maps, because some they didn't. I don't even put the railroad, but that one they decided to have the railroad on it. So that other one from 1898, they even put neighborhoods. They even put North Yarmouth on. It almost made it seem like North Yarmouth went to a train station, which it didn't. But that North Yarmouth was a Manchester neighborhood, to the confusion of those who see people who were born in Yarmouth or went to Yarmouth and thinking, why are these people going so far away from Manchester? But no, they were just going out towards Forest Street. So, so yes, I would say yes, they made a little bit of a liberty in representing where the station was on that map. Ultimately, I suppose they were more concerned with where their street railways were going than where their steam railway, their competitor, was going. Yes, sir.
I think possibly you could see something that you talked about happening in town this year, because we've been talking about the transit-oriented district for a long period of time. I'm sure the cricket is going to start to get overwhelmed with letters. I'm sure there'll be mailings coming out telling you how to vote, which of course they didn't have then, although you have to go mail it about now if you want to get it before the town meeting. But the large town meeting you talked about, I think, is predicted for this November, because it'll be the first town meeting they've ever had in the gymnasium at the high school, with the overflow being in the auditorium for possible capacity of about 1,400 people. So just kind of looking ahead and looking back is kind of interesting, because they both deal with transportation, and this one with housing also.
Yes.
One more question.
One more question.
When the system became defunct and the infrastructure was still there, who was responsible for repairing the road? Was it the companies that owned the trolleys, or the towns themselves who were taking away the rails and rebuilding the roads that they had been running?
You see, who was responsible for removing the road, removing the infrastructure?
Yeah.
Ultimately, it was the company, because the company still existed. It was Eastern Massachusetts Street Railway at that time, and then they were busifying, and they owned the infrastructure. And from my research, I believe it was the company, because technically this was private infrastructure. They formed, the street railways, they were regulated, and they were utilities, but they were privately operated and they weren't subsidized as well. Later on, the railroad ended up having to be subsidized by the Massachusetts Transportation Authority, MBTA, and they have a private company, if I recall, that operates the railroad, though they're subsidized by public funds. In this case, yeah, I would say it was the company that it would fall to, not the municipality for that infrastructure.
Gillian, you had a question, right? And that'll be the last.
All right, well, we'll take another one. We'll
Yeah,
take
and
another
then people can come up to Matthew afterwards and talk to him
Well,
privately.
Yes, I'm available to talk afterwards.
Yeah.
I wanted to know what the omnibus was. It was before the horse-drawn trolley.
Yeah, so the omnibus, which that goes back to the early 19th century. So the omnibus, which you can almost see how sort of the bus, the auto bus, motor bus, was sort of a revenge of the omnibus in a certain sense. That was a horse-powered vehicle that was operated as a public carriage, open to all who paid a fee, and it operated like you'd expect a bus to. They would have roofs, but they were running on the road, and actually it was heavier than what the street railways had, and they weren't running on rails, and so ultimately the street railway had an edge over the omnibus. But the omnibus, that was very prevalent. By the time of the street railways coming, omnibuses were already established, and as you might expect, the omnibuses did oppose street railways coming, similar to how the stagecoach companies, the stagecoach operators, they resisted the steam railroad coming in, but they already were established by the time of street railways coming to this area.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much. I'm open. More questions if you'd like to come see me.